Police later said the first signs were easy to miss. Nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded urgency, just moments that, when placed side by side, didn't fully make sense. On an ordinary weekday morning, one of the UK's busiest motorway corridors in the northwest was operating as normal. Traffic moved steadily, commuters followed familiar routes, commercial vehicles passed through without interruption. By mid-morning, routine patrols were already active, monitoring traffic flow and responding to minor incidents, the kind that occurred daily on Britain's road network. From the outside, it looked like any other working day. The vehicle that drew attention did not stand out at first. It was not visibly damaged, not reported stolen, and not linked to any immediate alert. The reason it caught the eye of officers was subtle, a combination of timing, location, and behavior that prompted a closer look. These moments happened countless times every day. Most end with a brief stop, a short conversation, and nothing more. At that point, there was no clear indication of what officers were dealing with, no certainty that the situation involved anything beyond a routine check. The intention was straightforward: to bring the vehicle to a controlled stop and assess matters properly. When officers signaled for the driver to pull over, they expected compliance. Instead, the response immediately changed the nature of the encounter. Rather than slowing, the vehicle continued. Within seconds, it became clear the driver had no intention of stopping. As the situation escalated, officers were forced to shift priorities. What began as a routine traffic matter became an issue of public safety, containment, and control. The decision-making window narrowed rapidly. Officers could not yet know why the driver was refusing to stop, only that the behavior posed a growing risk to others on the road. The driver was later identified in court as Mairead Francis. He was not described as a leader or organizer within criminal networks. His role, as prosecutors would later explain, was practical rather than strategic. He was someone trusted to move between locations, someone exposed to risk. The stretch of motorway he was traveling on was significant. It linked major towns and cities and was commonly used for the rapid movement of goods across regions. At the time, officers could not know what Francis was carrying or what he believed he was protecting. As the vehicle accelerated, officers formally declared a pursuit. Emergency systems were activated and communication with the control room became constant. Supporting units monitored the developing situation, while those directly involved focused on keeping the vehicle contained and preventing the incident from spreading into surrounding roads. Other road users were forced to react with little warning, creating a scenario where the margin for error was extremely small. Francis's driving was later described as reckless and unpredictable. His actions escalated the risk at every stage. After briefly leaving the motorway at junction 11 for Daresbury, he accelerated across a traffic island, narrowly missing a heavy goods vehicle before rejoining the motorway he had just exited. For officers, this marked a clear turning point. Whatever the reason for his behavior, it was no longer possible to treat the incident as routine. The pursuit continued until the BMW exited at junction 10 for Stretton. Francis drove through a red traffic light and onto a traffic island where the vehicle collided with a Toyota Hilux before striking roadside barriers. Despite the severity of the collision, no serious injuries were reported. Officers detained Francis at the scene and secured the area. Only once the immediate danger had passed did the focus begin to shift from managing risk to understanding motive. Francis was arrested for dangerous driving. At that stage, the case could still have ended as a serious traffic offense. However, the circumstances surrounding the pursuit raised questions that could not be ignored. Officers were aware that attempts to evade police at such speed often point to deeper concerns. What mattered now was what had prompted the behavior. Attention turned to the vehicle itself. During a search of the BMW, officers discovered a large quantity of cash wrapped in a rubber band and located in the passenger footwell. Francis admitted the money belonged to him. The presence of cash, combined with the manner of driving and the attempt to evade police, immediately raised suspicions of wider criminal activity. Although no drugs were found on the motorway or in the vehicle at that time, officers believed the incident was likely connected to drug supply.
Further concern arose from Francis's behavior after his arrest. While in custody, he was seen attempting to damage a mobile phone seized from the vehicle. Officers treated this as a potential attempt to destroy evidence. Taken together, the driving, the cash, and the damaged phone suggested the motorway incident was not isolated. It appeared to be one part of something larger. That belief prompted immediate further action. Officers began preparing to search addresses linked to Francis. The focus was on determining whether the motorway journey was connected to the storage or movement of controlled drugs elsewhere. What they had uncovered so far raised more questions than answers, but there was a clear sense that the most significant evidence had not yet been found. When officers from Cheshire Constabulary traveled to North Wales to execute a warrant at an address in Wrexham, the scale of the case changed entirely. Inside the property, they discovered substantial quantities of controlled drugs, including cocaine and cannabis, alongside cash and luxury items. The quantities involved made it clear that this was not connected to personal use. The discovery fundamentally altered the scope of the investigation. The items recovered were treated as evidence of involvement in drug supply and criminal benefit. Investigators also examined phone data and movement patterns, linking the motorway journey to ongoing criminal activity. Prosecutors would later argue that the attempt to evade police was driven by the risk of exposure, not panic. Francis was subsequently charged with multiple offenses, including dangerous driving, possession with intent to supply controlled drugs, and possession of criminal property. When he appeared at Mould Crown Court and pleaded guilty, the court was presented with the full sequence of events. He was sentenced to a total of 4 years and 4 months imprisonment, along with a driving disqualification and further restrictions reflecting the seriousness of the risk created during the pursuit. With that investigation concluded, the focus shifted, not to another motorway or another vehicle, but to a case that raised different and more troubling questions. One that did not begin with a chase, but with trust. Because while Francis was operating on the edges of criminal networks, another individual was working inside the system designed to stop them. And long before his actions were exposed, scrutiny had already begun.
Because while Francis's case had reached its conclusion in court, investigators elsewhere were still examining a very different set of concerns, ones that did not involve a visible pursuit or an obvious trigger, but patterns that only became clear over time. The individual at the center of this second investigation was Kashif Mahmood, a serving officer with the Metropolitan Police. At the time the offending took place, Mahmood was attached to an emergency response team based at Stoke Newington Police Station in North London. This was frontline policing. The role involved responding to incidents, carrying out vehicle stops, and operating both marked and unmarked police vehicles as part of daily duties. It came with autonomy, discretion, and a significant level of trust. Outwardly, Mahmood appeared no different from his colleagues. He reported for duty, wore the uniform, and worked within established procedures. There were no immediate complaints, no obvious misconduct visible on the surface. His length of service meant he had full access to police systems and was authorized to carry out stops under lawful police powers. That normality was important. It allowed him to operate without raising suspicion and to move through situations where his presence would not be questioned. What colleagues did not know was that Mahmood's role inside the police force placed him alongside an organized criminal network that was already operating at scale. That network was centered around Mohsin Khan, supported by his brothers Shahzad Khan and Shabazz Khan. Alongside them was Maria Shah, Mohsin Khan's partner, who played a role in handling and concealing criminal cash. Together, they were engaged in the wholesale supply of controlled drugs and the laundering of significant sums of money. Their activities were not confined to street-level supply. Instead, they focused on distribution at a higher level, with cash proceeds moving regularly between individuals and locations. Investigators later established that the group also maintained international links. Members traveled to Dubai, where relationships were sustained, and coordination took place away from the UK. These trips were not treated as casual travel. They formed part of how the network maintained contacts and managed money connected to drug supply. Communication within the group relied heavily on encrypted messaging, which at the time was believed to offer security from law enforcement scrutiny. Within this structure, Mahmoud offered something no other member could: direct access to police powers. Evidence later presented to the court showed that Mahmoud used his position to assist the group in intercepting cash belonging to rival criminals. These interventions relied on deception rather than force. Couriers believed they were dealing with legitimate police officers acting lawfully. Cash was taken without any official record, leaving those couriers unable to explain the loss to those higher up the criminal chain. A civilian associate, Ian Gurgel, played a supporting role during these encounters, posing as a police officer and reinforcing the appearance of legitimacy. He was not a serving officer, but his presence was central to how the scheme operated. Within the hierarchy, Mohsin Khan coordinated activity, while others carried out defined roles. The organization functioned with discipline and planning rather than impulsive decision-making.
As the conspiracy developed, the scale of what was being taken became clear. Investigators later confirmed that at least $850,000 in criminal cash had been seized through these unlawful interventions. The court also heard that this figure did not represent the full extent of the offending. There were attempted seizures that did not succeed, including one operation targeting a much larger sum. Even where plans failed, they demonstrated how confident the group had become in exploiting police authority. One significant incident took place on the 8th of March 2020 in Chingford, East London. On that occasion, Mahmoud used a marked police vehicle during what was believed to be a cash transfer connected to drug supply. While the exact amount taken could not be fully quantified, it formed part of a wider pattern that investigators were already beginning to piece together. But schemes like this depend on secrecy, and that secrecy began to weaken when authorities gained access to the group's communications. In April 2020, European law enforcement agencies succeeded in infiltrating the encrypted messaging system being used by organized crime groups across multiple countries. As data was shared with UK authorities, investigators began identifying conversations linked to drug supply, money laundering, and corrupt activity. Among them were messages that directly implicated Kashif Mahmoud. Those communications showed him receiving information about cash movements and coordinating his actions around those details. The case was taken on by the Metropolitan Police's Anti-Corruption Unit, which began a focused investigation into Mahmoud's conduct. Surveillance was authorized. His movements, vehicle usage, and access to police systems were examined in detail. Investigators compared encrypted messages against duty logs, vehicle records, and official databases. Patterns began to emerge. In one instance, Mahmoud's body-worn camera footage captured activity that contradicted legitimate policing explanations. This footage was later used as evidence, reinforcing the prosecution case that his actions were deliberate and unlawful. Investigators also established that he had misused police computer systems, accessing information for the benefit of the criminal network rather than for policing purposes. These actions were not isolated errors. They demonstrated a sustained breach of trust. Arrests followed in April 2020, with further arrests carried out in July as the investigation widened. By that point, the evidence gathered from encrypted messages, surveillance, and internal police records left little doubt about the scale of the corruption. With intelligence secured, investigators moved to obtain physical proof. Warrants were executed at properties linked to the network. Significant amounts of cash were recovered from multiple locations, reinforcing the prosecution case that the funds were proceeds of organized criminal activity. Designer goods and luxury items were seized and treated as evidence of criminal benefit.
One aspect of the case drew particular attention. When officers attended the address Mahmoud shared with his wife, Shireen Kashif, who was also a serving Metropolitan Police officer at the time, a shoebox containing a substantial quantity of cash was present in the bedroom. Evidence showed that the box was moved and concealed during the police search on Mahmoud's instructions. In interview, Shireen Kashif admitted moving the box, knowing it belonged to her husband. The court later rejected claims that she had no understanding of what she was concealing. Controlled drugs were also recovered from addresses linked to the group, supporting the finding that the network remained actively involved in supply alongside money laundering. Each search added to a picture already emerging from encrypted messages and surveillance. Individuals who might have appeared loosely connected were shown to be part of a single coordinated operation. By the time the case reached Southwark Crown Court in 2021, the scale of the offending was laid out in full. Mahmoud faced charges of conspiracy to acquire criminal property and misconduct in public office. Several co-defendants pleaded guilty, while others were convicted on the strength of the evidence presented. In sentencing, the judge described Mahmoud's conduct as a gross abuse of trust, emphasizing the damage caused not only to public confidence, but to policing itself. Mahmoud was dismissed from the Metropolitan Police and placed on the barred list, preventing any future service. He was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment, reduced from 12 to reflect his early guilty plea. Substantial custodial sentences were imposed on the co-defendants, reflecting their roles within the network. With that case concluded, investigators moved their attention once again, not to corruption within policing this time, but to a separate operation that had quietly been unfolding over years, moving large quantities of drugs into the country without attracting attention. And as with the cases before it, the first signs had been present long before anyone realized what they were looking at.
Those early signs emerged not through a single dramatic incident, but through repetition. Movements that looked legitimate when viewed in isolation began to form a pattern when examined over time. Between 2017 and 2018, an organized crime group quietly established what would later be identified as one of the largest cannabis importation operations uncovered in the UK in recent years. The operation was not built quickly. It relied on routine, consistency, and the careful use of systems designed for lawful trade. Investigators later concluded that over this period, the group was responsible for importing approximately 2.5 tons of cannabis into the UK, with an estimated street value of more than £15 million. For a considerable time, the activity passed without attracting sustained attention. To keep the operation hidden, the group relied on a series of false commercial fronts. On paper, these businesses appeared legitimate. In practice, they existed only long enough to receive a small number of high-value consignments before being quietly abandoned. One front presented itself as a kitchen supply company, supposedly importing specialist equipment into the UK. Documentation described items such as oven filters or kitchen components, creating the appearance of routine commercial trade. Other shipments were routed through companies claiming to operate in cold storage and produce distribution. These businesses were used to justify the movement of refrigerated loads, allowing drugs to be concealed among pallets of vegetables. Investigators later noted that the use of perishable goods reduced the time available for detailed inspections at ports and distribution centers, allowing loads to move quickly inland. Addresses linked to these businesses often led not to functioning warehouses but to lock-up units and industrial yards. Locations in Luton and Bolton were repeatedly used as temporary storage points. Each business followed the same pattern. It would be used briefly, sometimes only once or twice, before being replaced. Names changed, paperwork moved on, and a new front took its place. The rotation made it difficult for patterns to be identified early. At the center of the operation was Scott Byron, described by prosecutors as the organizing and controlling figure behind the conspiracy. Byron did not handle drugs directly. Instead, he managed the operation from a distance, overseeing routes, front companies, and the movement of consignments from Spain into the UK. Publicly, he presented himself as a second-hand car dealer. Frequent travel to mainland Europe was explained as business or linked to his son's motocross competitions. In reality, those trips were used to coordinate shipments and manage logistics. Byron owned property near Alicante, embedding his presence in Spain without immediately raising suspicion. From there, he maintained oversight of the supply chain, relying on trusted associates to handle activity in the UK. One of those associates was Wesley Kinsler, described in court as a close and trusted link between Byron and the UK side of the operation. Michael Lawler and Tony Cadman were connected to the use of storage locations, including the lockups in Luton and Bolton. These sites allowed consignments to be received and redistributed without drawing attention to a single base. Further down the chain was Lee Jackson, whose role became clear after police recovered drugs from a stolen vehicle linked back to the group. Each arrest and seizure revealed how tightly interconnected the network was. Individuals relied on one another to keep the operation moving, and the removal of one created pressure on the rest. As the investigation widened, attention turned to a rural site in North Wales, known as Bog Farm near Erris. What appeared to be an isolated farm was later revealed to be part of the group's longer-term strategy. Beneath the land, investigators discovered a concealed underground structure built using buried storage containers. The layout indicated it was intended to function as a large-scale cannabis cultivation site.
The structure had been constructed years before its discovery, showing significant planning and investment. However, despite those efforts, the site never became fully operational. Investigators found that the underground conditions were unsuitable, preventing sustained production. When the farm was searched, evidence pointed to a failed operation rather than an active one. Two men linked to the site, Michael Moore and Michael Harley, were arrested. Both later admitted involvement in constructing and attempting to operate the underground facility. Their arrests confirmed that the group's ambitions extended beyond importation. They were prepared to invest in domestic production if circumstances allowed. The operation began to unravel in August 2018. Border Force officers at the Port of Dover intercepted a consignment arriving in the UK disguised as a legitimate commercial delivery. When examined, officers uncovered a significant quantity of cannabis concealed among produce. The seizure marked a turning point. It was no longer a matter of isolated suspicion, but clear evidence of a large-scale importation conspiracy. From that point, investigators moved quickly to trace where the shipment was headed and who was responsible for receiving it. Raids followed at lockup units linked to the false businesses. At one site in Luton, officers uncovered evidence connecting the premises to earlier imports. At another, in Bolton, a stolen Mercedes containing cannabis was found, further linking locations and individuals. As each site was searched, patterns became clear. Packaging methods matched those used in intercepted shipments. Addresses, vehicle movements, and communication records aligned with the cover companies already under scrutiny. What initially appeared to be separate storage points were, in reality, part of a single coordinated network. Arrests followed in the UK as the scale of the conspiracy became clear. Meanwhile, Scott Byron was arrested in Spain after a European arrest warrant was issued. He was detained near Alicante, where he owned property and had been managing elements of the operation. After being held by Spanish authorities, he was extradited to the UK. Byron's return marked the collapse of the network's leadership. With supply routes disrupted and key figures in custody, the operation could no longer function. What remained was to account for the full extent of the offending and to determine how the courts would respond to a conspiracy measured not in individual transactions but in tons. When the case reached Manchester Crown Court, the scale of the operation was set out in detail. The court heard how legitimate systems had been exploited and how the operation had prioritized financial gain over the wider harm caused to communities. As sentencing approached, financial investigations began to run alongside the criminal case. Prosecutors examined the benefits gained from the conspiracy and the assets available for recovery. What they found would raise further questions about how profits had been handled and how much of the operation's proceeds had truly been accounted for. Those questions would be addressed in the final stage of the case, where evidence, accountability, and consequence would finally converge.
Those unresolved questions became central as the case moved into its final phase. With the network dismantled and the principal figures identified, investigators turned their attention to accountability, financial benefit, and the long-term implications of what had been uncovered. This stage was not about sudden discoveries, but about careful review. Every document, every seizure, and every statement was examined to ensure the full scope of the offending was properly understood. When the proceedings reached Manchester Crown Court, the prosecution laid out a detailed chronology of the operation. It showed how the conspiracy had developed gradually, how legitimate commercial systems had been exploited, and how the group had adapted whenever pressure increased. The court heard that this was not an opportunistic scheme, but one built on planning, repetition, and calculated risk. Scott Byrne was presented as the central organizing figure. The judge was told how he had managed the operation at a distance, rarely placing himself near the drugs themselves. Instead, he coordinated routes, front companies, and personnel, relying on others to handle the physical movement of consignments. His ability to maintain a respectable outward image had allowed the operation to function for a significant period without intervention. The court also considered the roles of Byrne's associates. Wesley Kinsler was described as a key facilitator, linking instructions from Spain to activity in the UK. Tony Cadman and Michael Lawler were shown to have provided storage and logistical support through the use of lockup units. Lee Jackson's involvement, though further down the chain, demonstrated how distribution relied on trusted individuals at multiple levels. Evidence presented included records of intercepted shipments, details of false business registrations, and material recovered during searches. The failed underground facility at Bog Farm was also addressed, not as an active production site, but as proof of the group's ambition to control both importation and domestic supply. The judge noted that while the bunker never became operational, its existence showed the lengths to which the group was prepared to go. As part of the sentencing process, the court placed emphasis on harm. While the case focused on importation and logistics, the wider consequences were not ignored. The judge referred to the impact of large-scale drug supply on communities, stressing that offenses of this nature extended far beyond those directly involved. The motivation throughout, the court found, had been financial gain, pursued with little regard for those consequences. Sentences reflected both the scale of the conspiracy and the individual roles within it. Scott Byrne received a custodial sentence of 14 years and 2 months. The judge described his role as central and sustained, noting that the operation could not have functioned without his oversight. Tony Cadman was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, while Wesley Kinsler and Michael Lawler each received sentences of 9 years. Lee Jackson was sentenced to 9 years and 4 months. Michael Moore and Michael Harley, whose involvement related primarily to the construction and attempted operation of the underground site, were each sentenced to 2 years and 9 months after pleading guilty. Taken together,
The sentences amounted to more than 5 decades in prison, reflecting the seriousness with which the court viewed the overall conspiracy.
Alongside custodial sentences, the case moved into proceedings under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Prosecutors argued that Byron had benefited by almost £9.8 million from the operation. However, when his assets were examined, only a relatively small amount could be identified. The court issued a confiscation order for £18,235, covering items such as a luxury watch and mobile phones, with a warning that further assets could be seized if discovered in the future. The disparity between the estimated benefit and the assets recovered was noted by the court. It highlighted a recurring challenge in organized crime cases. Profits are often moved, hidden, or dissipated long before proceedings reach this stage. Even so, the financial investigation served an important purpose, demonstrating that criminal benefit would be pursued wherever possible. With sentencing complete, the case was formally concluded, but its significance extended beyond the individuals involved. Investigators pointed to the operation as an example of how organized crime can embed itself within legitimate systems, relying on routine processes to avoid detection. The use of false businesses, repeated routes, and short-lived fronts showed a clear attempt to stay below the threshold of scrutiny. Authorities also highlighted the role of patient investigation. The case did not hinge on a single breakthrough, but on years of incremental work. Patterns were identified, intelligence was shared, and evidence was built carefully before enforcement action was taken. This approach ensured that when arrests were made, they were supported by a comprehensive body of proof. In statements following the conclusion of the case, law enforcement agencies emphasized that operations of this nature are rarely uncovered quickly. They rely on cooperation between border authorities, local police forces, and international partners. The interception at Dover was a turning point, but it was effective only because groundwork had already been laid. The outcome also reinforced the message that organized crime groups, regardless of how sophisticated they appear, remain vulnerable to sustained scrutiny. The rotation of front companies and storage sites may delay detection, but it also creates records. Over time, those records form patterns that can be traced and challenged. Looking back, the investigation echoed the theme that opened this story. What appeared ordinary for a long time eventually revealed deeper inconsistencies. Movements that once blended into the background became visible when viewed together, and individuals who believed their roles were insulated by distance or disguise ultimately faced accountability. As with the earlier cases, the final outcome was not defined by a single dramatic moment, but by persistence. Quiet examination, methodical review, and coordinated oversight brought the full picture into focus. In the end, the systems that had been exploited were also the systems that exposed the truth. And that is often how these cases end, not with spectacle, but with evidence. If you want to stay up to date with the most shocking real-life UK crime stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.